Hello there, my RPG lovers, and welcome to another video. When Obsidian announced that Avowed will have a third-person perspective, I was really surprised to hear that. This game was always promoted as a first-person RPG, and make no mistake, it's certainly meant to be played in first person. That was the original idea for the game, and it feels like the most developed gameplay mode, perspective, or however you wanna call it.
How about the troops been doing historically?
If you watch my videos, you probably know that I'm not a huge fan of first-person RPGs, simply because I think this perspective can seriously limit the potential of gameplay mechanics. On the other side, the first-person perspective is certainly the most immersive camera mode you can have in your game, and I would say that only VR games can be more immersive. Putting that aside, I really wanted to learn how good is Avowed in third-person perspective ever since I learned that it's going to have one. In order to properly analyze this gameplay mode, you would need to put quite a bit of hours into it, which I did. For the past 20 hours of gameplay, I think I only switched to first person a handful of times. When I wanted to capture some nice B-roll for the upcoming review, or when I wanted to compare these two perspectives for this video. As a matter of fact, I don't even know how good this game is in first-person perspective, because the moment I got the review key, I started playing like this because I think this would be a fun video to make.
Have you ever felt aimless?
I know there are people like me out there who prefer third-person perspectives, so this should be a useful video if you're thinking about buying this game, but you're not super excited to play it in the first person. So, is Avowed worth playing as a third-person RPG? Let's find out. First of all, let me start by saying that having different options in the game is great. Being able to change the camera perspectives by press of a button is highly appreciated. Even if you only want to use the third-person perspective to look at your shiny armor or a new weapon. As someone who holds the visual progression in RPGs in high regard, I would even consider this feature to be mandatory in games. Even if you can't engage in combat in this perspective, it doesn't matter, just let me see my badass character in 3D every once in a while. It might sound silly to some people, but I truly believe that.
Wrong? What is wrong?
I saw some people comparing this game to Skyrim's third-person mode, so let's address that real quick. Vanilla Skyrim was very stiff in third-person perspective, while Avowed is on the opposite side of this spectrum. It can feel very floaty, but definitely not stiff. I would say that Avowed's third-person is much better than Vanilla Skyrim. Is it better than a fully modded Skyrim though? Hell freaking no, but that's kinda not fair, I guess. Skyrim had different sets of animations in first and third-person mode, which created an unnecessary disparity between them. Well, Avowed is not like that. You can clearly see that all attacks are identical in both camera perspectives. That means that Avowed's combat is pretty consistent regardless of the camera mode, and the overall feel doesn't change when you switch perspectives. It doesn't change that much, to be more precise. Come to think of it, I think Avowed's third person is more similar to Elder Scrolls Online. As for the subjective feel of the gameplay, I think Avowed has a lot of similarities to Greedfall, but enough with the comparisons. To be completely honest, I expected a lot worse when it comes to this camera perspective and the game in general.
That's the sanest thing I've heard all day.
However, I've been enjoying Avowed quite a bit so far, even though I think some parts of the game are extremely boring and there are some baffling design decisions, but more about that in the upcoming review. My first impressions with this camera mode were much better than expected, because I thought this feature is going to feel very unfinished. Let me just say that this camera mode is completely functional and it's definitely not an afterthought. I mean, they announced the existence of this camera mode very late in development, so it goes without saying that people will think it's going to suck. The decision to put a brand new perspective in a game like this is not done lightly. There are countless of new animations you have to do in and out of combat, while trying to ensure that the feel of the gameplay is at least similar in both camera modes. Well, third-person camera in Avowed is definitely serviceable, but I would even say it's more than that. Avowed's combat system is pretty decent for an RPG, but not so great for an action game, if that makes sense. If combat is all that you care about in these types of games, you might get disappointed after trying Avowed. I was playing as a melee class who focuses on two-handed weapons, and I also used bows and some guns here and there. Moving around in third person is totally fine, although I would like to see more options to adjust the camera. Oh, and by the way, I played the Xbox version of the game, which kinda looks horrible sometimes, especially in the open worlds. It seems like the game struggles a lot in open areas, and you can see the resolution scaling being very aggressive, which makes the picture on my TV extremely grainy. This is the performance mode, by the way. I don't really care about the fidelity mode and less FPS, it's kinda pointless to me. Anyway, most animations outside of combat are pretty decent, while some other are very clumsy, I would say. Even though some of these sections look very goofy because of the animations, I don't think they feel bad at all. I never had any major issues with the character movement in general, and as a matter of fact, I quite enjoy it. Sprinting around the map and jumping feels great, and it's easy to get used to, at least it was for me. That's because the controls in Avowed are snappy and responsive in general, and switching the camera perspectives won't affect this that much. The game looks the goofiest when you sprint with your character and try to strafe a little bit. It looks very floaty and unpolished. Speaking of lack of polish, there are some other animations that can be described as such. Your character can grab pretty much everything that even remotely looks like the ledge, and the animation for it could have been a lot better. Seriously though, you can find indie games with zero budget that have way better animations than this. The good thing about it, you can increase your dexterity stat to speed up the animation or find some items that will give you similar benefits. Yeah, you can do that in this game, and I think it's very freaking cool. Jumping around and grabbing ledges almost make you feel like you're playing an Assassin's Creed game, and Obsidian made sure to take the fullest advantage of this mechanic. The world map is extremely vertical, which obviously go hand to hand with this mechanic. The exploration is definitely my most favorite thing to do in Avowed so far, and I would even say that this camera perspective makes it even better, just because it's easier to see everything. When you increase your dexterity, you start climbing the terrain way quicker, and everything that makes your character more mobile is a plus in my book. It looks like they just didn't have enough time to properly polish these animations. I mean, I refuse to believe that this is the best they can do, because some animations in the game are pretty good. And you have to know what you're doing with animations when you decide to make a first-person game, because you have a lot of technical limitations. When all of that is said and done, you have to seamlessly blend both camera perspectives and animations. I mean, you can see what I'm talking about. So the only logical conclusion is that this camera perspective just needed more development time and polishing. But at the end of the day, I think the functionality of these mechanics is way more important than the optics.
Since when do you make the rules?
And the functionality, as well as the subjective feel of these mechanics, is great. I could zoom around the map at a very fast pace, not worrying about making a wrong move, even when I'm climbing on a very big hill. The way the game lets you climb on almost everything with a ledge is just absurd, but I really appreciate this. If something looks like you can grab it, you probably can, and you can go absolutely crazy with this mechanic. If you're curious as a cat, this will cost you a life or two sometimes, but it's definitely worth it. Not only for the great view, but the open world in Avowed is full of useful items that you can loot, and it's clear that Obsidian even expects you to abuse this mechanic. You'll find something to loot even on places you didn't expect. Although I wish they went even crazier with this and place even more items on quote-unquote unreachable places. Now, all of that sounds very good, however, I kinda lied when I said that I didn't have any issues with the movement, because I have one. If you press A button while trying to strafe, your character will instantly dodge to that side. That works great in combat, but outside of it, it's just freaking annoying, and I guarantee it will cause you to die at least a couple of times while climbing on steep terrain. This is one of the most, if not the most janky mechanic in the game. If the third-person mode had a full 360-degree movement, this wouldn't happen. And they could just disable the dodge when your weapon is sheathted. That would substantially improve the movement, in my opinion. Now, let's talk about how the combat feels in this mode, which is definitely the most important topic if you're even considering playing this game in this perspective. One of the biggest advantages of this camera mode, regardless of its quality in general, is obviously the peripheral vision in combat. So, by default, you have a better vision on the battlefield in third-person mode, and Avowed makes you fight multiple enemies at once almost all the time. That matters a lot, especially if you're playing on harder difficulties. There are things which makes this a bit more bearable in first-person mode, like when your followers give you some info about incoming attacks, and they even tell you exactly where it's coming from, so you can dodge properly. The UI also helps you with this, but anyway, it's much easier to see more enemies on the battlefield in third-person mode, there's no even question about it. Speaking of visibility in combat, the third-person mode also allows you to see more effects on the ground a lot easier. A lot of NPCs in the game have some sort of a telegraphed attack on the ground, and being able to see the ground better definitely helps a lot. All of this is just common sense when you think about it, it's just the difference between the two modes. I think there is a key difference in how these two modes in games are perceived by players. As mentioned before, the first-person mode is way more immersive, and that's why people who love this mode won't even care that much about technical limitations. There are certain technical advantages in first-person mode as well, like being able to better see which attack enemy is preparing to use. The telegraphy of animations in melee combat is not great in this game. It can be hard to see when to react to enemy attacks because of this, regardless of the camera mode. Actually, the third person is even worse when it comes to this, because it becomes harder to see what the individual enemy is doing. It's a rare occasion where you actually have a mechanical advantage in first person. I like to use the parry mechanic when possible in games like this, and it's definitely easier to do it in first person because you can see what's going on up front. If melee attacks were properly telegraphed in this game in general, third person mode would be just fine. As for the third person perspective and how that mode is being perceived by people, we usually have certain expectations from it. This camera perspective is very common in action games, action adventure, Souls-like action RPGs, and so on, you get the picture. If you're coming into this game expecting a similar experience to those games, you will probably be disappointed. That being said, the game has a solid amount of modern combat mechanics that you would expect to find in action RPGs nowadays. Some other quote-unquote modern stuff is very cringe, but more about that in the review.
Barrett's balls. Just my luck.
All enemies have a stun bar that you gradually fill up with your attacks, and then you get a chance to do some big damage. You can dodge, block, and parry, and I think the biggest strength of Avowed's combat system is the variety of playstyles. The magic seems pretty fun as well, although I didn't use it that much so far. To give the game some credit, the combat definitely doesn't lack the sense of weight and impact. Attacks feel punchy, the feedback is pretty solid, and enemies react in a satisfying way upon being hit. The character progression is decent, but it's a bit too systematic for my taste, and more about that in my review. All of these mechanics work totally fine in third person, and they don't magically get worse because you switch the perspective. Now, there is some noticeable stiffness when the game makes you use the soft lock-on system, which makes the third person look and feel more awkward than the first person. Avowed doesn't exactly have a traditional lock-on system, but for example, if you hold the block button and face the enemy, your character will track the enemy in a similar way like the target lock. Come to think of it, I would call this a smart lock-on system, and it's pretty cool and it works fine. However, the third person camera makes it a bit more awkward and stiff. Mostly because the camera quickly snaps to the enemy in front of you, and this effect seems more mild in first person. There's also some awkward delay of your hits sometimes, and I can't exactly pinpoint the problem here, it feels like input lag. It doesn't happen that often though. Using skills in this perspective is arguably even more satisfying than in first person modes. I would rather watch my character shoulder charge the enemy than just my hands. And it's very precise, I rarely miss my abilities. But not all abilities feel fun to use in this perspective. For example, the protection bubble that one of your companions can cast lowers the visibility a lot, I can't see shit in combat. While the first person mode is not heavily affected by this, as you can see here. Still though, I think they should reduce the transparency of this skill, it's very freaking aggressive. Now, you can ask a legitimate question here. C4G, what is stopping me from switching this camera mode in different situations? And the answer is obviously nothing. As a matter of fact, that's how I would usually play Skyrim back in the day. I would play in first person in dungeons and close quarters and switch to third person in the open worlds. But this video is all about the quality of the third person camera perspective. I had no issues to explore closed areas while using this camera perspective, by the way. Mostly because Avowed is very colorful and it's easy to see everything, even in very dark areas like caves, underwater zones and so on. That being said, I think the first person camera works much better in those situations by default, and if I played normally, I would just switch between these modes very often. Then we have the ranged combat, which works fine in both modes. It's way more satisfying in first person for obvious FPS reasons. Speaking of which, there are actually FPS mechanics in this game, since you don't only get to fire your magic and bow, you can use guns. Like I said, all of this feels fine in third person mode, but it's much more satisfying in first person. I mean, shooting things is always more satisfying in FPS games than third person shooters, but you be the judge here. This camera perspective works just fine with ranged weapons in general. As for some miscellaneous situations, the third person mode is a bit annoying when swimming, when you're trying to look up because the camera goes under the water.
I am under the water, please help me.
The first person mode doesn't have this issue, and it's much more pleasant to explore the water depths in this mode. I would describe my whole experience with this camera perspective just like that, it's fine. It works okay, and you won't have any problems with it, if you have at least some previous experience with similar games. It won't blow you away or anything, and it's definitely unpolished in certain areas. To put it simply, if you're looking for an amazing third-person action combat or Souls-like mechanics, you're not going to find that in this game. But the action is solid in general for what the game is trying to be. And to sum it up, the third-person mode is much better than what we all expected, I guess. It's not a tacked-on feature, even though it's rough around the edges for sure. I've been enjoying the gameplay quite a bit, and it shouldn't take me long to finish my review, so stick around for that. Make sure you subscribe and help your boy reach that 100k subscribers, I'm getting very close. And if you want to go a step further, consider supporting your boy by becoming a YouTube channel member or a Patreon. Huge thanks to all my current supporters, and I'll see ya in the next one.